I was standing in the kitchen of the beach house my husband and I had owned outright for 9 years. Fully paid off, deed in our name, property taxes current to the penny, when I heard the sound of a lock being changed on the front door. Not picked, not forced, changed. The specific, deliberate sound of a locksmith working methodically through a hardware replacement. The kind of sound that takes several minutes and that I recognized immediately because my husband Thomas is a contractor and I have heard that exact sound approximately 40 times in our marriage. I walked to the front door and opened it from the inside. It was still unlocked at that point, the locksmith mid-process, and found a man in a blue uniform kneeling in front of the doorframe with a drill, and standing behind him in white linen pants and oversized sunglasses, holding a manila folder and looking, for one single unguarded moment, genuinely startled to see me. My sister-in-law, Patricia. She had told us, 2 days earlier, that she was spending the week in Charleston with friends. She had apparently, instead, hired a locksmith to change the locks on a property she had no legal claim to, no ownership stake in, and no right to access without our knowledge. A property whose deed, mortgage, satisfaction letter, and HOA registration were all filed under my husband's name and mine in the Beaufort County Register of Deeds, where they had been sitting, unambiguously, for 9 years. I looked at her across the threshold of my own front door. I looked at the locksmith, who was now looking between us with the specific, uncomfortable expression of a man who has just realized he may have been given incomplete information about the nature of the job he was hired to do. I said, very calmly, "Sir, I'm the legal owner of this property. Could I see whatever documentation you were given before you continue?" Before I tell you what that documentation said, and what the Beaufort County HOA director had been quietly compiling for the previous 3 months, tell me, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? I genuinely read every single comment, and I want to know. And I want to be upfront before we go any further. This is a work of fiction, written for entertainment. The names, the people, and the events. None of it is real, and any resemblance to anyone living is entirely coincidental. My name is Caroline Marsh. I'm 44 years old, and for 16 years I've been married to a man named Thomas. Steady, generous, a contractor who built his business with his own hands and who has, across 16 years of marriage, never once done anything I would describe as careless with money or property or the things we've worked to build together. Thomas has one sibling, his older sister, Patricia. Patricia is 49. She was, for most of the time I'd known her, a woman I would have described as difficult but manageable. Opinionated, competitive in the particular way of someone who measures her own life, primarily through comparison to others, and possessed of a specific, chronic tendency to treat Thomas's accomplishments as things she was somehow entitled to share in, simply by virtue of having grown up in the same house as the person who achieved them. She had never, before the summer I'm about to describe, done anything I would have categorized as genuinely criminal. I want to be precise about that because it matters for understanding how completely the events of that summer changed my assessment of what Patricia was actually capable of. The beach house. A 3-bedroom cottage on Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, purchased 9 years ago for $387,000 and paid off in full 6 years later through a combination of rental income and deliberate overpayment. Was, without question, the single most consequential financial decision Thomas and I had ever made together. We had found it during a particularly difficult year. The year after Thomas's contracting business had its first genuinely profitable season. The year we had finally allowed ourselves to believe the financial stability we'd been carefully building was real and not simply a temporary condition that would reverse itself if we stopped paying close enough attention. We had driven down to Sullivan's Island on a long weekend with no particular intention of buying anything, walked through that cottage on a Saturday afternoon in September, and looked at each other in the kitchen. The kitchen with the window that faces the water, the one where I was standing the morning Patricia hired the locksmith. And known, simultaneously, and without needing to say it, that were going to find a way to make it work. It had taken 4 months of negotiation and 9 years of careful management. Meticulous rental accounting, HOA compliance, property maintenance that Thomas handled personally because he trusted his own work more than anyone else's. And it was, by the summer in question, generating approximately $38,000 annually in rental income while appreciating to an estimated market value of just over $800,000. Patricia knew these numbers. She knew them because Thomas, who was constitutionally incapable of concealing his own financial achievements from family members who asked directly, had told her. More than once. In detail. I had watched her absorb those numbers, over the years, with an expression I had learned to read. A particular, controlled blankness that was, I had come to understand, her specific performance of indifference when she was actually, internally, calculating something. The beach house situation began, technically, 18 months before the locksmith appeared on my doorstep, with a conversation Thomas had with Patricia at a family Christmas gathering that I was not present for. He told me about it afterward, in the car on the way home, with the slightly troubled expression he gets when something doesn't sit right with him, but he can't yet fully articulate why. Patricia had apparently raised, casually, over Christmas dinner, the subject of their late parents' estate. Specifically, the fact that their parents had owned a small vacation cabin in the North Carolina mountains that had been sold 12 years earlier, as part of settling their estate, with the proceeds split evenly between Thomas and Patricia. She said she felt like the split wasn't fair. Thomas told me, his hands on the steering wheel, his eyes on the road. She said she felt like the cabin had more sentimental value to her than to me, and that the way it was sold didn't account for that. And then she kind of implied that she thought the Sullivan's Island house sort of balanced that out. That's because I'd had the capital to invest in it after the estate sale, and she hadn't, because her circumstances at the time hadn't allowed her to invest her share. She felt like there was an imbalance. I looked at him. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said I didn't really follow the logic," he said. And she said, "Just think about it, Tom." And then Mom changed the subject. I thought about it, in the passenger seat of our car on the way home from Christmas, and the conclusion I reached was straightforward. Patricia believed, for reasons that did not correspond to any legal or financial reality, that Thomas's beach house represented a debt she was owed. I filed that conclusion carefully away. The following spring, Patricia made her first actual move. She contacted the Beaufort County Register of Deeds office. I learned this, months later, through a public records inquiry our attorney filed, and requested copies of the property records for the Sullivan's Island cottage. She also contacted the HOA management company for the property's community association, identifying herself as Thomas's sister and requesting information about the property's rental history and current income documentation. The AI Management Company, a professional firm that had been managing the Sullivan's Island community's administrative operations for 11 years, had a director named Eleanor Walsh, a thorough, detail-oriented woman who had, over those 11 years, seen enough unusual property inquiries to recognize one when it arrived. Eleanor had not provided Patricia with any information. She had, instead, documented the inquiry carefully, logging the date, the nature of the request, Patricia's name and contact information, and her own professional assessment that the inquiry appeared unusual, given that the requester was not a property owner in the community. She had also, quietly, sent Thomas a brief notification email, letting him know that someone claiming to be his sister had contacted the HOA with questions about his property. Thomas had read that email, mentioned it to me with visible confusion, and filed it away as likely a misunderstanding. Eleanor Walsh had not filed it away. Eleanor Walsh had kept the log open and continued adding to it over the following months, in the particular methodical way of someone who has decided, professionally, that a situation bears watching. Patricia's second move came 4 months later, and it was considerably more aggressive. She had, apparently, in the intervening months, consulted with someone. I don't know whether it was an attorney, a financial advisor, or simply a friend with opinions, but someone had given her the impression that a concept she described in a letter she subsequently sent to Thomas as equitable family contribution might have legal merit in the context of family-owned vacation properties. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten. Patricia had always preferred handwriting for significant communications, a habit I had previously found charming and that I now found, reading this particular letter, considerably less so. It argued, in considerable emotional detail, that the Sullivan's Island property had been made possible, in part, by the family estate sale proceeds, and that those proceeds represented a shared family resource whose subsequent deployment in a profitable asset created an ongoing equitable claim by all family members who had contributed to the original estate pool. In plain language, she was arguing that because the estate sale proceeds had partially funded Thomas's investment in the beach house, she was entitled to a share of the beach house. This argument had no legal merit whatsoever. Our attorney, a sharp woman named Sandra Perkins, who had handled Thomas's business contracts for 7 years, reviewed the letter and told us, with the specific patience of someone explaining something to people who are too emotionally close to a situation to find it as straightforwardly absurd as it actually is. This is not how property law works. The estate was settled. The proceeds were distributed. What Thomas did with his share afterward is his business and his alone. Patricia has no claim here. What I'd suggest is a clear, documented written response making that plain, so there's no ambiguity about your position. We sent that response, drafted by Sandra, via certified mail. Patricia signed for it. We have the receipt. She sent no reply. For 4 months, there was silence. The specific, unnerving silence of someone who has stopped arguing openly and may have begun planning differently. Thomas and I arrived at the Sullivan's Island cottage on a Thursday afternoon in late July, planning to spend 10 days there before the property's next rental booking. Patricia had told us, the previous week, in a brief text message that read with the particular cheerful casualness of someone performing normalcy, that she was heading to Charleston for the week to visit friends and wouldn't be around. The first 2 days were entirely ordinary. The weather was warm, the water was calm, and Thomas spent most of the first morning replacing a section of deck railing that had weathered over the winter, because that is simply what Thomas does when we arrive at a property. He walks around it, systematically, and fixes the things that need fixing. On Saturday morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee, looking out the window at the water, when I heard the sound of a drill at the front door. The locksmith. A man named Gary, from a Beaufort locksmith company I was later able to identify through his company logo on his uniform, had been hired by phone the previous afternoon. He told me this himself, in the driveway, with the cooperative honesty of a man who had just realized he was standing in the middle of a property dispute and wanted absolutely no further involvement in it. He had been given a verbal description of the property, the address, and instructions to replace all exterior locks with a new key set. He had been told, he said somewhat carefully, that the property was undergoing a management transition, and that the current lock set needed to be changed before the new ownership assumed control. New ownership, I repeated. That's what I was told, Gary said. I didn't ask for documentation. I probably should have. Patricia, standing a few feet behind him, had by this point reassembled her composure into something closer to the performance of confidence. The oversized sunglasses now functioning as a kind of armor, the manila folder held in front of her with both hands like a prop she'd prepared. Caroline, she said, I know this seems abrupt, but I've had an attorney review the situation, and there are legitimate equitable grounds for. Patricia, I said, is Thomas's name on the deed to this property? A pause. Tom's situation doesn't. Is Thomas's name on the deed? I said again. Yes or no? The legal situation is more complex then. Gary, I said, turning to the locksmith, please do not change any additional locks on this property. I am the legal co-owner. My husband is the legal co-owner, and I'm going to call the Beaufort County Sheriff's Department right now. I'd like you to stay until they arrive, because they'll want to speak with everyone present. Gary put down his drill with evident relief. I called Thomas first. He was on the back deck and came around the side of the house in under 30 seconds, and the expression on his face when he processed what he was looking at. His sister, a locksmith, a half-changed front door lock, the manila folder, was the specific, very quiet devastation of someone who had been extending the benefit of the doubt to a person for a very long time and has just run completely out of it. He said one thing to Patricia before I called the sheriff. "Patricia, why?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, with a composure I found, honestly, somewhat extraordinary given the circumstances, "Because it should have been mine too, Tom. Some of it should have been mine." Thomas looked at his sister for a long moment. "You had your share," he said quietly. "You had exactly what I had. What you did with it afterward, that wasn't something I could control. And it isn't something this house owes you." He turned away, and I made the call. The Beaufort County Sheriff's deputy who responded, a calm, thorough woman named Deputy Rachel Holloway, spent the better part of an hour taking statements, reviewing the documents I provided from the property file I keep in the cottage's fireproof document box, and speaking with Gary the locksmith, who cooperated completely and provided, in his written statement, the specific language Patricia had used when hiring him, including the phrase management transition and the claim that the property was changing hands. Eleanor Walsh, the HOA director, was called by Sandra Perkins that same afternoon and provided, within 24 hours, a complete documented log of Patricia's unauthorized inquiry into the property's rental and income records from 4 months earlier. A log that, combined with the certified mail documentation of our attorney's letter and Patricia's signed receipt and Gary's statement, built a timeline that left very little ambiguity about what had been planned and how long it had been in preparation. Patricia was charged with attempted criminal trespass, filing a false property claim, and obtaining services under false pretenses. The last charge relating specifically to her misrepresentation to Gary about the ownership status of the property. The manila folder she'd been holding turned out to contain a document she had apparently drafted herself, not reviewed by any actual attorney, despite her claims, purporting to establish an equitable lien on the property based on the family estate theory her letter had outlined. It had no legal standing. Sandra described it, in the understated language of a professional who finds certain things more amusing than she allows herself to show, as impressively formatted but entirely without merit. Patricia pleaded no contest to the criminal trespass charge. She received a fine of $4,500, 2 years of probation, and a permanent civil injunction prohibiting her from entering, contacting management of, or making any legal claim against the Sullivan's Island property for a period of 10 years. The lock Gary had partially changed was restored to its original hardware by Thomas personally the following morning, because Thomas is a contractor, and it took him 11 minutes, and he preferred to do it himself. We still go to Sullivan's Island every summer. The cottage is still ours. Deed unambiguous, locks original, HOA records current, rental income steady at approximately $39,000 this past year, up slightly from last. Thomas and Patricia have not spoken since the day on the driveway. I don't know whether they will again. That is Thomas's decision to make, not mine. And he is still, I think, processing what it means to discover that someone you grew up with has been building, quietly and deliberately, towards something like that for the better part of a year. Eleanor Walsh, the HOA director, attended the Sullivan's Island community's annual owners meeting the following spring. A casual outdoor gathering at the common area pavilion, the kind of event where people bring wine and talk about maintenance schedules and occasionally complain about parking. And Thomas spent 15 minutes in conversation with her that I watched from across the lawn. He came back smiling, in the specific way he smiles when he's genuinely, uncomplicatedly grateful for something. She said she kept the log because something felt off, he told me. She said she's been doing this job for 11 years, and she's learned that when something feels off, you write it down. Every time. even if nothing comes of it. I looked at him. She sounds like Margaret Chen, I said. And Thomas, who knew exactly who I meant, laughed the specific full laugh that means something has landed exactly right. Every property has a neighbor paying attention. Every situation has someone keeping the log. It matters enormously to know which side of the log you're on. Do you think Patricia's 2-year probation was appropriate? Or should the attempted property theft of an $800,000 asset have carried a harsher sentence? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, subscribe to the Family Ledger for a brand new story every day. New story every single day. Hit the bell so you never miss one.